Streets flooded with immigrants, a population skyrocketing to over 3,500,000 people. The Brooklyn Bridge connected the worlds of Manhattan and Brooklyn. 16 inches of snow covered the ground in February in one of the largest blizzards on record. And a group of boys working for ridiculously low wages took a stand against their employers, America's largest newspaper company.
And the world will know, and the journal too.
At the turn of the 20th century, two of the most important and profitable newspapers in America were the New York Journal, owned by William Randolph Hearst, owner of the largest chain of American newspapers, and the New York World, owned by Joseph Pulitzer, the man who created the business model for modern newspaper companies. These two men dominated the newspaper industry in America at the time. One of the ways they built their empires was with the tactic of yellow journalism. This idea was first introduced by Hearst, as he employed the technique to generate more newspaper sales than his competitor Pulitzer. The basis of yellow journalism is the idea that the headlines and stories have to be enticing, even if that means stretching out the truth a bit. To give a more exact definition of yellow journalism, it is an exaggerated, exploitative, sensational style of newspaper reporting. Some of the most sensational headlines of the age came from coverage of the Spanish-American War of 1898, making it a press-driven war, but more importantly, a battle for profit. Although, the real war for dominance in the newspaper business was fought on the streets. That is where the Newsboys enter into the story. Newsboys were young kids who sold newspapers to help their families put food on their tables or to support themselves, as many were orphans. They got paid about 30 cents a day. Even in those days, 30 cents wouldn't buy much. And for these newsboys, who were nicknamed newsies, the long days of working on the streets weren't paying off for anyone other than the newspaper owners. It was time to take a stand against Hearst's and Pulitzer's unfair working conditions. In July of 1899, the New York Newsboys banded together in a fight for equal economic opportunity in what became known as newsie strikes. Under the leadership of Kid Blink, a 14-year-old Irish newsboy, youngsters boycotted the sale of newspapers from news outlets like The World and The Journal, mobbing the streets with their rallies and setting the precedent for the creation of modern child labor. During the Gilded Age, high-production newspapers like the New York World and the New York Journal gave much-needed job opportunities for the poverty-stricken street kids, known as the newsies. The rights of the average worker were very slim, but for the newsboys, they were even slimmer. While some states made efforts to provide children with better working conditions, by the late 19th century, these protections were not strictly enforced or regulated. In 1836, Massachusetts required children under 15 who worked in factories to attend schooling at least 3 months every year. In 1842, Massachusetts limited children's work days to 10 hours, the only state to do so at this time. In 1883, New York achieved its first labor regulation for children in the workplace when the state prohibited cigar making in tenements, a huge industry in which thousands of children were employed. The newsies worked hard with no protections and no guaranteed income. Their business model was simple: go to the printing factories to buy newspaper bundles for 50 cents, then sell them on the streets for a higher price in order to make a commission. The little money the boys were to make was typically used to buy food and other necessities, though they might scrape up a few cents to purchase an occasional luxury like cigarettes. Then, just prior to the turn of the new century, this marginal existence was further threatened when the cost of newspaper bundles increased to 60 cents. This increase made it even harder for the newsboys to buy newspapers and sell them for a profit. This was the breaking point. They had to take a stand for equal economic opportunity. With the onset of the Spanish-American War, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst met together and agreed to raise the prices of their newspapers. This had a huge impact on the ragtag group of starving, homeless newsboys. The newsies now had to pay 20% more to buy the initial papers from the manufacturers before selling them to the public. The public wasn't happy about the price increase, and sales dropped, leaving the newsies more broke and starving than ever. The boys refused to pay this new high price and took a stand by boycotting the sale of newspapers from the World and the Journal. The boys did this in hopes of convincing the public to boycott the newspaper companies alongside them. During the strike, the newsies tore up papers from the World and the Journal and strewn them all over the streets. By striking, they not only hoped to bring their struggle to light, but also to negatively impact the income of newspaper companies drastically.
A good many of the Postal Telegraph Messenger boys yesterday carried out their threats to strike. Most of the 45 boys employed at the office at 20 Broad Street changed their uniforms for plain clothes, walked out, congregated in the streets, set pickets, and began intersecting those boys who had remained at work and were sent out with the messages. The New York Times, July 25, 1899.
The Newsboys continued to fight during their 2-week strike, taking to the streets of downtown Manhattan, creating traffic jams, and marching together across the Brooklyn Bridge.
Strikers made their most determined stand near the Brooklyn end of the bridge. Here, the pavement in some places was littered with the remnants of packages of the 2 afternoon papers. Placards were posted up in conspicuous places condemning the 2 afternoon papers. Kill the guy will sell the extras. This was a notice pasted up on a bulletin board early in the morning. The Brooklyn Eagle, July 30th, 1899.
The sheer number of newsies brought local life to a stop, disrupting traffic and bringing in numerous complaints from citizens. The newsies were determined to continue the disruptions until they got what they wanted.
With yells of triumph, they pulled out all the papers from the wagons, tore them up, and scattered the pieces. The New York Times, July 25th, 1899.
The Newsboys also made their voices heard by marching in parades, blocking off roads, posting signs, and preventing other newsboys from doing their jobs.
No true friend of organized labor will read them papers. We's got other union papers. Pay a penny and read them. The New York Times, July 25th, 1899.
The Newsboys effectively cut people off from buying newspapers, even destroying newspaper stands around New York City in hopes that their actions would change in the way they were treated. Pulitzer himself recognized the power of the Newsboys' stand when he received a memo from a trusted colleague on July 22, 1899, stating,
The Newsboys' strike has grown into an extensive and menacing affair, encouraged by the other newspapers and backed by street railway people. It is proving a serious problem.
4 days later, on July 26, 1899, a telegram sent to Pulitzer described the current situation.
Much work required to restore circulation and rehabilitate paper will public.
Realizing the outrage of the public and the loss of revenue, Pulitzer and Hearst were forced to restore the newspaper's original price. By effectively reducing the new tyrant's profits, the newsies were triumphant in taking a stand for their economic opportunities. Their efforts led to a restoration of the price by both the World and the Journal. The Newsy Strike of 1899 led to a nationwide awareness of the need for child labor reform. Photographs of the Newsboys, taken by Louis Hine, were seen by the National Child Labor Committee, founded in 1902 by 3 of the most influential Progressive-era leaders, Florence Kelley, Lillian Wald, and Jane Addams. The National Child Labor Committee set out to protect children from working in unsafe conditions. This committee later created National Child Labor Day, a day of support for child labor laws. The Newsies taking a stand for equal economic opportunity also inspired future strikes by child workers, such as the Butte, Montana strikes in 1914 and the strikes in Louisville, Kentucky in the 1920s. The Newsies strike, along with other progressive-era movements and laws, built the foundation for greater reforms for child labor laws later in the 20th century, such as the 1936 Walsh-Healey Act, which stated that the U.S. government would not purchase goods made by underage children. It took many years and much political will for a Child Labor Act to pass, but one eventually did. In 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act was successfully passed, abolishing child labor throughout the nation. For the first time, the minimum age and maximum hours of working for children were regulated by federal law. The Newsboys took a stand for their economic freedom by boycotting the sale of newspapers from news outlets like The World and The Journal, mobbing the streets with their rallies, and setting the precedent for enacting modern child labor laws. These brave kids boycotted, held rallies, and spoke up against the injustices they were facing.
This was a true historical event. The Newsboys of Manhattan at the turn of the century banded together and managed to stop one of the most powerful men in this country from taking advantage of them.
Their courage inspired other child workers to fight for greater economic freedom, which then led to protective legislation for generations of kids around the world. The Newsies struggle helped allow kids to be kids. The Newsies represent just one fight in a long line of children taking a stand for social justice. People like Malala Yousafzai and the Red Guards, the teens who fought during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. More recently, kids have been standing up for their beliefs on immigration, environmental justice, and social equality. By making their voices heard, today's younger generations are building on the work of the Newsies. These boys help show us that everyone can fight for what they believe in and win. They inspire us to stand up against injustice, regardless of the powers aligned against us, by using nonviolent strategies to take a stand for what's right.
And the world will know, and the Journal too. Mr. Hearst and Pulitzer, have we got news for you? See the world